Yeah, this prayer from the WACC Congress 2008 in Cape Town, South Africa. So let us pray together. You are accused, good teacher. You ate with the sinners. You touched the unclean. You offended common decency. We had thought you came to bless us, but you keep going to those we do not understand, those we do not trust, those we fear. We want you to confirm our prejudice, but you settled them. Cemeterians, children, lepers, women, tax collectors, a sick friend, a dead daughter. All of these you blessed and healed. Those we distance ourselves from, you actually touch. We grumble at you, not sure that we can follow you in this way, not strong enough to overcome what we have always been taught, not open enough to see the depth and breadth of your grace. Forgive us, Jesus. Turn our grumbling into acts of courage. Turn our codes of conduct into the dark conduct of compassion. Turn our condemnation of the failures of others into the awareness of our failure to love others with your grace and compassion. Forgive us, Jesus, and make us new until we become one with the lost ones, until we become lost in your love. Amen. Let me introduce the sponsors of this series of webinars. Three organization sponsors of this the webinars. The first one is the Transformative Ecumenism Collective, we call TEC, and KIFE, the Korea Institute for the Future Ecumenism, and lastly, the World Communion of Reformed Churches. So a warm welcome to all of you to join us in this ongoing journey of exploration for new meaning and possibilities for creative engagement in the world today. And now I would like to introduce our speakers. Dr. Heidi Campbell. She is a professor of communication and a presidential impact fellow at Texas A&M University. She is also director of the Network for New Media, Religion, and Digital Cultural Studies. Her research focuses on technology, religion, and digital culture with an emphasis on Jewish, Muslim, and Christian media negotiations. She is a co-editor of Luther's Religions and Digital Culture book series, The Journal of Religion, Media and Digital Culture, and author of over 100 articles and books. So welcome, Dr. Campbell. So now it's your turn. You have 25 to 30 minutes for your presentation. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me this morning/this evening. It's good to be able to speak with you and especially to reconnect with people that I went to school with many years ago. So I have been studying the intersection between religion and digital culture for almost 25 years. And so today what I want to share with you is about kind of some of the observations I've seen over that time, and especially in the face of kind of recent developments about the pandemic and how technology is shaping religion and Christianity during this time, and what impact it may have for the future of how religion and church is done, not just in my context, but in global context in the West and the world. So over the last 25 years, we've seen a lot of changes, not just in how people, live their lives, but how religion is enacted and engaged with in everyday life. And digital technology has become, as it's become more and more a part of our everyday reality, it's also influenced how we do church and how we kind of prepare for church. So one of the key theses that my work focuses on is looking at how religion is performed in a digital age, and how, to what extent, the conditions of a technological society shape and inform that. So in communication media studies, we talk about the idea of living in a network society, about how, as our world has become interconnected through computers, not just our communication has changed, but how our social relationships have changed, and how our interpersonal relationships. Emmanuel Castells, who is a sociologist of religion, he talks about how society has changed because of computer networks and increased computer network communication. He describes the network society as the social relationships that have become increasingly decentralized, yet interconnected through a social technical infrastructure. And scholars like myself have studied how this has impacted especially religious communities, faith communities, and churches. And we can think about over just the last 100 years within church context. It used to be we would talk about churches in terms of maybe a parish or the certain kind of territory a church would be and a pastor would be responsible for. It was much a kind of a geographic time notion. But over the last 100 years, we've seen people not just going to the church in their neighborhood or in their religious denominational affiliation. They go to the places where they feel most connected. And so we've seen this movement from a parish geographic context to much more kind of urban and interconnected, and worship becoming much more infused with technology, connecting people to time and space. And in the last, year, especially, many churches that had maybe resisted technology or using it in their services, whether that was to broadcast their service or just to have a website, digital location, have been forced into this digital revolution because of COVID and lockdowns or quarantine periods where people physically couldn't engage. And so we've seen that that technology has become essential for people to do church. And it's not just affecting the practical aspects, but it's also affecting how people see one another and interact. So this slide, in the last decade especially, we've seen a kind of shift in church from very much traditional hierarchical kind of arrangements to much more collaborative experiences and opportunities. This idea of church after Google is after the church has basically been forced into the digital revolution and to engage technology in order to carry on its ministry and work and services. We've seen a kind of shift, instead of the church being just led by the priest or the pastor, that it takes much more of a team orientation, and the team being part, of people such as the tech team and people helping kind of rework how you actually kind of do a service when you have a camera and you have to web stream or live stream when you're not able to meet face to face. We see that instead of talking about churches in terms of the denominational affiliation and faith-based, we talk about in terms of collaborations. And in the last year, we've seen a lot of interesting experiments with people having to work across denominations and across churches to help one another with these technological changes and to interact and get up to speed. And so, church being kind of a very much more formal bounded community, it's shifting to this kind of metaphor of the network where people are get interconnected, they're loosely bound relationships, and this kind of these social conditions of the reality of how we live our lives in the digital age is really strongly impacting the church. And so I want to talk about especially how that's happened over the last year and what that could look like for the future of religion and Christianity. So like many of you in March, I found myself in a very interesting situation when, especially I was in Europe at the time when the global pandemic hit the West, and was having to kind of quickly respond to the shutdowns that were required at that time. So I've been again, I have a lot of friends who are ministers, and I regularly follow on Facebook my different pastor friends that I have of mine online. And it was interesting, over a 1 week period, I went from maybe a half dozen of my friends on my feed webcasting their services on a Sunday morning to over about 30 or 40 people in just over one Sunday. And so for the first 6 weeks of the pandemic, I spent a lot of time on Facebook to keep up with what was going on in different parts of the world, to stay connected to my own faith community back in the US while being in Europe, but also just to kind of see the different changes that were happening. And I noticed some very interesting kind of trends. First off, when pastors had to go online, and especially churches that had not been using digital technology or streaming their services, the first rush was just get those services online. And so many churches just trying to say, how do we just transfer our services online? And many people using the internet, much like you would do in television, trying to broadcast the service and say, just saying, what are the basic requirements we need just to get our service streamed online, on Facebook, on YouTube? And so I call this the transfer strategy, just trying to do what we've always done, but get it done in a way that is accessible to people. But very quickly, many churches found that, that the transfer strategy didn't always work. Sometimes it was because people didn't have the technological capabilities. And other times it was because of the stress of the pandemic. It kind of made people feel even more distant, saying, okay, here's the pastor sitting in the church doing taking part in the worship service, but I'm here disconnected at home. So people began to see that digital technology might require, and the situation require, adapting. So we saw a lot of interesting experiments with pastors trying to adapt and relate to their congregations in new ways. So maybe doing the service from the pastor study rather than from the church. So kind of to say, instead of in the robes in everyday clothes, saying, hey, I identify with you. I too am separated from normal routines, and I can relate. So let's kind of turn the service into a conversation rather than what we're used to. Or maybe tuning the service for those churches that had a lot of technology experience or resources into maybe even more like a talk show. So it's more of an interactive event. And people began to see that, Zoom had a lot of new possibilities for them. And the idea is that let's create it to be more of a conversation, which digital media allows for, in interactivity. But the challenge became is even if people tried to adapt to the conditions of the pandemic and even what technology would allow, they realized just because you put your service online and just because you create opportunities for people to maybe comment on a YouTube video or interact doesn't mean it's actually a two-way interaction. It still feels a little bit disconnected and limited. And so over the last 6 months, especially in different parts of the world, we've seen different pastors and churches realizing that we need to not just adapt to kind of what the technology allows, but kind of and the cultural moment, but looking at what really is the basis of church and what is really needed. So over the last 6 months, I've seen a lot of interesting experimentation with different churches, not just rethinking, how you the practicalities, but what should church look like? What should worship look like? And what does community look like, especially when you can't meet on a weekly or regular basis? And so experiments like this is an example of a pastor and up in the left-hand corner in England is trying to redo Palm Sunday in a different way when you can't meet face-to-face. And her small village in England had an annual kind of pilgrimage around the village where they would sing and pray for the community. And she kind of modified it by having members of her congregation put crosses on their palms and doing a virtual kind of tour around the city as a way to kind of pray and still bless their community. But rethinking about how can we represent church in the services? Maybe it's not a service that happens in the same way. Maybe it's just a pastor sharing his sermon and then creating a small group networks so that people will then break into groups and have a Zoom conversation through that platform to interact. So a different kind of way of doing church. And so through these experiments, I began to kind of work with friends to kind of document some of these things that were happening. And over that, I produced a set of 3 ebooks that kind of talk about the lessons that have been learned for the church through their engagement technology over the pandemic. So what I want to talk with the rest of my time here is introduce some of the key themes that came out of these 3 books. The first one, The Distance Church, was produced within the first 2 months of the pandemic. And it was a combination of me bringing together pastors and religious leaders who were trying to say, how do we deal with these new conditions, and how are technology being helpful or challenging us during this time? And those religious leaders brought into conversation with scholars like myself who've been studying religion and technology, trying to share, this is some of the things we've learned in the past that might be helpful for this present moment. In the second ebook, Religion in Quarantine, this was me bringing together a group of religious studies scholars who studied not just Christianity, but Islam and Judaism, and looking at how those different religious communities were also having to adapt to these changes because of COVID, and how might the new patterns and new experiments change the future of religion, especially of religious practice on a regular basis. And then finally, the digital ecclesiology came out in late August, early September. So several moments on from the early days of the pandemic. But this was bringing together especially theologians from around the world to reflect on, if this becomes our reality, how are we going to have to adapt and adopt new strategies in the future, and what could the theological implications be? So what I want to share is a couple of kind of the key findings from each of these books, and then offer that as a space of conversation for the group. So first off, in the Distance Church, the pastors, I could say one of the key takeaways that they had was that we need to be willing to be flexible and experiment. And this is a challenge because, church liturgy has been developed over years, and how we do worship is often very kind of very formulaic and very kind of a part of a religious pattern for us. So when churches move online, this represents a shift not just in how we see church, but how we relate to one another. And so being willing to kind of set the liturgy aside and say, what is needed at this moment, and how might we kind of change what's our traditional offline practices to engage with the needs of online community and online interaction. Researchers from this volume came away with the ideas that there's a real need for pastors and religious leaders to really understand the digital media and digital culture. And this doesn't just mean the practical things about, so we can make choices like which platform do we use, YouTube or Zoom, what are the best cameras to use for webcasting, but really understanding when you use a technology and you bring it into the church or the sanctuary, how does that change worship? How does that change how people see their relationship to one another and to the spiritual encounter that they're having? So by increasing digital literacy of the implications of technology choices, their hope that a new relationship would arise where it's not just we grab technology because it's a good resource, or we resist against it because we don't understand it, but being in relationship with it and looking at how digital literacy might help us see how the technology can be used to our advantage, as well as kind of shape maybe new theological metaphors and reflections. In the ebook, Religion Quarantine, again, bringing together scholars from Jewish, Muslim, and Christian perspectives, we've noticed a lot of several similarities. For example, especially in the spring, we had Easter, Ramadan, and Passover all kind of overlapping in a similar area of time. And so we had religious leaders in all 3 of these faiths trying to say, well, how do we do worship when those events, those religious holidays are very much ingrained with face-to-face interaction and family interactions. So that move from just being offline religious experience to an online has caused scholars and to reflect on the future of technologically engaged worship. And one of the key learnings was that most of traditional worship is very embodied. It's face-to-face, and it's also event-based. So when that face-to-face interaction is interrupted, and that event, being able to gather at a specific time and for a specific practice is interrupted, for many groups is like, well, can we actually really worship? Can we actually really do what our religious practice? Because it's been so defined in these embodied and event ways. So how do we do a religion that is not embodied and that's not focused on just an event? And what flexibility does our community allow for changing that? Another key kind of reflection from the religious studies scholars was that quarantine reveals not just the power and possibilities, but the challenges many religious groups were not aware of. So, when you introduced, a computer into the home for doing the Passover meal together, how does that change the ritual of, Passover and that meal, not just in a practical way, but in things like sharing the cup, sharing the bread. There's been huge debates over the last 9 months about online communion. Can you do online communion? Can you have people doing it in a face-to-face way and then a mediated way? Should everybody participate in it, or should just the minister maybe take communion symbolically for the community? And so, and technology isn't just something we just adopt and move on, that it creates new challenges that we need to be reflective of. And finally, digital ecclesiology, again, was theologians trying to look at the bigger picture and what might be the theological questions we need to reflect more deeply on as faith communities and traditions during this time. So one of the things that came out was that digital innovations should not be seen as a temporary fix. That in our post-pandemic world, we don't know what the health concerns are going to be or the long-term impacts of the virus will be. Many people are seeing that people, even as churches do open up in some areas, people are not coming back because of health concerns or because of for other reasons. So, churches need to kind of consider how technology is not just have been a Band-Aid for this situation, but might have to be integrated long-term. And they need to test and continue to practice how the lessons that they've learned using technology, both practically and theologically, may be something that they need to reflect on in the long term and look at how it should be integrated. And finally, one key thing is that, that church during this time has really had to be very team oriented. Many pastors don't have the tech skills, so they had to recruit from people in their congregation or outside their congregation to get help. And also seeing the need to, many churches, especially in rural areas in the US, have become important Wi-Fi hotspots, but because they sometimes are the building in the small town that is most wired now because of the church doing the work to be able to webcast their services. So the future of the church, how might they kind of use these resources as places of and technology as an outreach, and also maybe empower people with digital and technological skills to not just see themselves as a member of a congregation, but important part of a new kind of ministry and ministry team to their community. So in conclusion, I just want to say that, I think that there's some these kind of principles give me a couple of thoughts that we need to think of and talk about deeper within our communities and leadership teams. So should technology be, as a part of the contemporary landscape, how should that be integrated? Is technology ministry and just an online, and then we have an offline version of church, or do we merge those intersections in a certain way? The realization that churches have often kind of ignored technology as an important part of culture and contemporary ministry. And so churches need to be aware of the kind of debates about the human technology relationship that are happening, and the need to be aware about how people frame humans and technology, because some discourses that we use or some ways we use technology can actually work against the theology we have of, of what it means to be in relationship with God and relationship with others. So our technology choices have theological implications. It also is, I think, that we need to think of this as what we call a contextual or practical theological approach. It means delving into the technological world means understanding what is theology's role in society today. In many places in society, theology and religion has been sidelined or seen as not part of the central aspects of culture. But theology has a lot to contribute, especially thinking about ethical implications and human implications. How can we kind of see theology's unique contribution, not just the church, spilling over into culture and helping reflect? And finally, that this discourse about theology and technology, it needs to be not just something happening in the West or in Korea or things, but it needs to be a global theological discourse that is including voices from many aspects of the world, many different Christian traditions, and look at how by bringing together a common conversation around this new challenge could help us enliven how our theology can infuse other parts of contemporary life as well. So I want to thank you for those reflections and thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today. And I look forward to your feedback.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Campbell. Your presentation is quite interesting. And your presentation mainly focus on church and church-related activities in digital age, and also what is the future of churches, how church has to change in digital age, something, and so on. Also, thank you for introducing 3 e-books. It is quite useful for us. Let me ask a question. Do you anticipate the COVID-19 may change the methodology or system of education and formation of the ecumenical movement or churches or Christian universities, things? So what COVID-19 affected our education and formation system?
I think, especially, and I'm talking, mostly from, the West and European context, that, there's been lots of debates in, theological education and religious education. What do we include, especially when we're training religious leaders? And some people have been arguing for there needs to be more digital literacy, media literacy. But if you add that into kind of people's training and curriculum, something else has to drop out, So do we kind of do away with one course in systematic theology in order to bring this in? And so I think that's a hard challenge. But I think, COVID-19 has showed us that it's not just the practical challenges that pastors and religious leaders need to be trained with, but really just kind of the theological implications of these choices. And this is something I've tried to advocate in my own research and in my own teaching, that when you make a technological choice, choosing Zoom over Facebook, it creates a certain kind of environment, and that environment has interpersonal implications, and it also has theological implications, because it's saying how you value people, or are you a top-down group, or is there space for interactivity, and that says certain things about values and beliefs and culture. And so I really think, that both kind of at the leadership level and training future leaders, but also in kind of, like Sunday schools and training our members, they need to be aware of kind of the ethical, but especially theological implications of how we use technology and what it says about how we see and treat the other in contemporary society. So I think, and it's hard choices we have to make, both kind of, what you take out if you add something in. But I think, it's, again, not just the practical, but the long-term implications of these choices that need to be reflected on.
Yeah, it's a good point. We not just the practical changing, but we have more focus on theological reflection on current situation. What is our implication theologically or educationally? Yeah, that is very good point.
Mm.
And now it's open to the floor for question and answers. You can raise your question by your voice, or you can using our chat room. Who will start?
Can I start?
Okay, yeah, Chris first.
Yes, thank you so much. I think with the experience that we have as a worldwide group is interesting. That immediately part of the question being involved in there's three levels of the kind of justice and social justice related issues to the whole question of being church, and particularly around the whole question of digital. The first one is the classic question of digital technology, about all of a sudden we found out that with a turn to having meetings and programs, as well as simply worship, that doing church also includes our diaconal outreach and our prophetic witness, and that in fact there is a question of digital justice around access, the ability for different communities to respond, different places that don't have sufficient bandwidth for Zoom. The second layer is the whole question of the control of big tech, and a lot of concerns in communities in places like the Philippines and other places about social control, and groups that are able to intervene and manipulate and monitor messages. And when the church finds itself in a position needing to speak out against dominant trends, the ability to simply disrupt organization and coming together by taking away the medium in which it happens, as happened in many revolutions, for instance, in the situation of Egypt and other places where Facebook and so on was just shut down when too many students were on the streets and the people in power wanted to stop it. Anyway, I think you, Dr. Campbell, will know where I'm going. So you have questions of distributive justice and access. You have questions of media and social control. And then the other thing, which I think you were hinting at, was the whole question of to what degree does the medium be the message, and what is actually kind of the formation now of the content or the meaning of fellowship. If more and more people's experience, as I like the title when you talk about distance, I mean, in your first ebook, what is deeply the kind of the epistemological questions, and the questions of kind of who are we and how do we know each other digitally. And I think you've been very good at helping us see how it's happening. But I just wonder, as we're talking about transformative things, are we needing to be more suspicious and more selective about our embracing of digital technology to the degree we're being led by big tech and others, and really have a power deficit in what we choose and how we choose to relate to each other?
Well, a lot of big theoretical questions there. So I'll take kind of them in like two really kind of practical issues that you raise, and the kind of implications of those. So the first, thing, the issue of access. In communication studies, we talk about that issue related to the digital divide. So to what extent, people have access to the technology. And, there's some people, especially during this time, have kind of felt, more disconnected from church because they didn't have the ability to get online. They didn't have the computer network or the, the cell phone data to do that. So I think, there's a practical level where churches are going to need to realize that, depending on the makeup of your congregation, age-wise, access to technology, as well as community resources, everyone jumping on and creating a YouTube channel is not going to be possible. So I think part of it is, is like, how can churches, kind of look at the resources that are available, and then to what extent maybe they have to fill in the gaps. I know several pastors, who, especially in the UK and the US, where they had elderly congregations and people just didn't have internet access. So what they were able to do is they were able to kind of find telephone services where they would actually record the sermon, and the people in the congregation who didn't have web access could log on through the telephone. And so I think it's kind of, with the technology, it's not a one size fits all that we give people, this is the way you should use it, but it's looking at how might we kind of create a network of resources. Also, I think one thing the digital divide is really challenged pastors to is that, you can't do this alone. And, and it really kind of says that in this age, technology is about collaboration. So, maybe you don't have the resources to do some of this web streaming, but maybe other churches do. Maybe you can partner together. And there's been some wonderful examples. I know, like a church in Texas, that they had a lot of, they streamed their services before the pandemic. And so they had lots of great cameras and whatnot. And so they made their studios open to churches who could come in like on a Friday or Saturday and pre-record their services. And then they actually helped them get those services online. So, not saying, okay, we have these resources and it works for us, but how can we help other people in our denominational network or even outside our denomination, and really seeing the churches being kind of communal and partnering. So I think technology, there's limits, but there's also creative ways around those things in some contexts. So I think it's, again, learning to kind of look at the church as really a community and not just as one individual unit trying to figure out how to keep the lights on and keep things going. The issue of kind of justice and technology is a big one. But I think, we already live in a digital age, and, sometimes the church likes, it's important to have those basic debates about, what happens when we embrace technology. But the reality is it's already integrated into people's everyday life. It's already informing and shaping their world. And if we kind of just go back to, well, should we resist it? Well, we kind of have to just deal with the reality of it's there. And I think it's more not telling people to shy away from it, but saying, how do we make just choices with the technology that's in our everyday lives? And how is as a church, even if you don't have web stream your services, even if you don't use technology, your people in your church are being impacted by it, by what they have access to and don't have access to, by how they are beginning to see people through the world because they spend much time on a computer, and how their lives are impacted when they don't have access to those resources. So I think it's a matter of kind of like, how do we kind of, do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly in a digital age, and look at, how people's worlds are being shaped, even if they resist or even if they don't have access to those technologies. And I think, church is moving ahead very quickly. The world is moving very ahead quickly. Especially with AI technology, we're going to have to, the church, say, make decisions about when we have cyborgs in our midst, and we already do, because people use regenerative technologies, they have embedded technologies in their clothing. The technology is already infused with everyday life. We don't have maybe robots in our congregation, but one day we might. And how do we see kind of the spirit? You can, if technology has transcendence, will they have eternal life? So I think, there's the big question of the future, but we really need to deal with the everyday and say, okay, how do we deal with, what is the human relation? What is human uniqueness, and how are we seeing in relation to God, and what happens when technology is part of that equation?
Thank you.
This is Angelique. When you get a second.
Who? Angelique. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. I thought you were taking more interventions. Is this not a good time?
You can ask.
Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for your presentation. This has been wonderful. Thank you. Really appreciate it. I just wanted to speak to the wonders and surprise of the deepening use of technology in our work. We're a small congregation. I'm a part of a few congregations, but this particular one that's very small, about 100 people maybe. And when we switched over totally into technology, of course, it was the younger generations, they helped to lead us in that way, right? And we started to get a pattern after about a month. And much to our stunning surprise, we realized that we had reached over 5,000 people. And we're like, what? How does that happen? Who are these people that would be tuned into our small congregation
5,000.
of what we're doing? I mean, this church was just stunned, just like stunned. This little place, how could we be reaching, in terms of that many people? Now, it wasn't everybody was staying all the way through. That was another number. I think it was like half the number. But what it showed us is that, we had just shut one building and, we're looking for another place right now too. And suddenly it just like hit everybody in the face. This is a new day and, we must do something different. But what it also showed was the empowerment of young people. And what it did was it spoke to your point that you raised around that people who help facilitate this in our churches or outside of our churches are a part of a ministry. This is not technology. This is a ministry, that everyone has a ministry in this work. And so what eventually happened was we eventually caught the vision that there needs to be more space for young adults to be able to tell their stories, for them to be able to be engaged, because they were the ones really leading in this moment. And so I just want to really pick up on these points of these kinds of generational shifts, but not only generational shifts, but the fuller inclusion of God's people to be peers in ministry, not hierarchical, but to be peers in ministry. The other thing that I'll share is just a challenge. For many of us, particularly in the communities of African descent in the US, there's been a huge digital divide. It's a major piece. And as you know, we have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19. These are because of the historic racial inequities, structural problems that we've had globally, as well as in the US context. And so it has disempowered the whole culture to some extent of people of African descent, because we're all about oral tradition. We're all about keeping company, external kinship, and all of those kinds of things. So I'm interested in terms of my question, besides my observations, is how do you think about lament and addressing lament using technology and bridging not only the digital divide, but the huge impact that COVID is having, particularly on communities like mine, around these issues. So I just think in either case, whether with or without technology, we have to balance both these priestly roles as well as the challenges and the opportunities of prophetic and care within our churches. So just interested in some of your thoughts about that. But thank you so much, and glad that you're sharing.
Thank you. Well, my most recent book that I just finished is called Digital Creatives and the Rethinking of Religious Authority. And it's a project I've been working on for the last decade, studying kind of this idea of could digital creatives be kind of a new arm of ministry in the church, but also kind of a new challenge to kind of how the ways we've done church in the past. And I think, your examples there of, kind of, it was, many examples of pastors kind of calling on the youth group or the youth group pastor to be the ones that got the church up to speed, to live stream their services. And that seeing people with technological skills as having a new ministry gifting that the church needs. And I think this is especially a great way to get young people to think, well, the church is all about those old folks, there's no space for me, where we can really kind of partner with people that have tech skills, and especially young people who have creativity, to help the church in practical ways, but also kind of turn it really into kind of a body, this collaborative ministry. I mean, this is the thing about digital culture. It's not just about the one person who creates a program. Every computer program or things are very team oriented, and so that ethos is part of especially youth culture, wanting to be involved. And I think breaking down maybe traditional hierarchical structures to allow that kind of teamwork is so important in that, priestly, the priesthood of all believers kind of ministry. And that the second issue that you raised, just the issue of inequity, I think it's a huge challenge. I think, the one thing that digital media allows us to do is allows us to kind of become community connected in ways when the technology works well and when we have access to it. And I think some ways, that it's again, this idea of partnership. I know that there's been several examples that I've heard of where churches, again, like they don't have enough resources to wire the one church, but maybe they have, to wire, their own church. But if they all collaborate together, they can create a community hotspot. So wiring one church so that it has access, it becomes a space where all the churches kind of can use that technology to, to webcast their services, but also becomes like a community center. And there's been, stories about churches where like they put on picnic benches outside in the summertime because of their sharing of resources. It was the most wired place in this small town. And so I think, that's important of seeing that. And that can also be a place that when we show how technology can bring us together, it can be a place of kind of community healing. I think lament is important during this time of COVID, because we're still mourning, it's not over anywhere. So I think how can technology create the spaces of remembrance to remember those who lost, to remember the challenges that we're still going through, and how can we use technology as collaborative and as a healing's resource is important.
Okay, good.
I'd like to raise another point here. Can I?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And listening from another angle, I think it is important to also highlight that for a lot of the people that I see in the global South, where in spite of how technology is transforming the world, as you rightly pointed out, it is still a major technological divide in terms of accessibility and the cost of engaging. And that too is impacting on how people engaged in worship within a pandemic world. I think I want to lift up some of the things that I see, because in my local church, in terms of where you see a lot of people signing on for online, they tend to be what I'd call diaspora Jamaicans all over the world. They're not Jamaicans from within the community itself. So yes, the local church is reaching a large cross-section of people, but as to whether or not the church is reaching people within the community itself through technology, big question mark. What I do know, however, is that in the area where the wider denomination empowers the local church to be, quote unquote, the church in the home. So the new church of the poor outside of the church as an event where they go for big gatherings for which government rules now limit that possibility. The church seems to be going back to the basic norm of its early development, the church in the home. And it is that kind of empowerment, I think, in terms of technology for small groups to function, and that they themselves become witnesses within the community that they serve. And the second point is the old technology of radio. Radio is still a very powerful system in developing country and how people engage with worship. and with other forms of witnessing. So you'll find the average person not able to purchase credit, as it were, to log on to Zoom, but they will always have their radio with them. And so I just want to lift up that other aspect of that which has always been with us, but never fully utilized, especially for the elderly. Let's not forget them and how they become involved in this experience, not just the young. A lot of them who have not yet acquire the basic skills of how to switch to this and to that with Zoom. It is still radio that keep them together. I just want to lift up those points.
I think that's a very good point. Often as we talk of technology, we're assuming it's the internet or, Zoom or even mobile.
Yeah.
But it's really a suite of technologies.
Suite, absolutely, yeah.
And so, it's looking at, in your context, what do people have the most access to and how can you use that? So it may be, and that puts more challenge on kind of leadership, because they go, okay, how do we kind of maybe use the radio and then combine it with other things to facilitate? I think the other good point you're saying is about, I think that's a lesson that many churches are learning, that it's, we used to think about the face-to-face, that one face-to-face gathering, and church is that gathering, and then there's some connection between the week. But this is really kind of done the reverse, saying that, the gathering is kind of like the check-in point, but church really needs to be in the homes or in small groups or in, home church or community group networks. And, I think some churches have, again, I tried to give the example of where the pastor, he webcast a 15-minute sermon once a week. And then the expectation was that they help facilitate people either meeting in socially distanced face-to-face groups or technologically mediated face-to-face groups. And that was really where church happened. And then he became almost like the postmodern circuit riding preacher, where he would either technologically or even journeying around the community, checking in with all those groups during the week, either by phone, face-to-face, even socially distant face-to-face, or via coming into a Zoom meeting and saying, I'm going to put the emphasis on connecting with the groups rather than just doing the service these weeks, because that's what my people really need. And so I think technology allows us, for giving us this creativity, but again, that's why it requires team ministry, because the pastor can't do all that either just because of energy and time wise, but also just technological skills that are often needed.
Okay. Meantime, if you see our chat room, so Dr. Campbell linked the ebook. It is free. So I have already downloaded the 3 ebooks. The content is quite useful. So it's free, so anyone can download them. So is there any other questions?
Not a question.
Okay.
Not a question, but a comment in terms of the team effort. I do support wholeheartedly the fact that the teams are being made up with lay people and clergy in order to be able to walk with the people that are in need. So what has happened in some of our dioceses is that we have put together a formation space to prepare people and enable them to be able to take care of people, the spiritual needs and the psychological needs because of the situation with the pandemic. So it's not only the clergy that is also there accompanying and serving. Lay leadership is also trained to enable them to walk alongside the people who are in need. And this has become quite effective. The other area of team effort you mentioned earlier has to do with the ecumenical movement, who has the resources and offering it to smaller congregations that may not have it. And that has also happened in my part of the kingdom, where bigger churches are helping other churches that don't have the resources so that they can, prepare their services during the week and then have them transmitted on Sunday. So yes, it has been definitely a team effort. Young people, lay leadership, and also within the ecumenical movement. And thank you very much, Heidi, for sharing with us this morning.
Thank you. Thank you. And great examples. And thank you for sharing that as well.
Thank you so much. I also just want to make a short contribution on what you have said. Thank you, Heidi, for this very, very interesting and rich presentation that you have given to us. I think it has a lot to put on our tables to think and try to figure out the way forward and how we are moving theologically into the future. At this stage, I'm also looking at just on what you are saying. I think one of the key things for us who are talking about transformative ecumenism is the issue of discerning the church. What is the meaning of a church for the context such as this one? How do we rethink what it means to be a church, to be congregations? And then coming to transformative ecumenism, we need to think much more hard in terms of what does it mean then for transformative ecumenism if we discern the church as we move forward? Because the traditional thinking about the church seems to be disintegrated, especially during this period of time. And what we are seeing is not one face of a church, but multiple faces of a church. As we have heard from Roderick, from you, there are all these many faces of a church, which is a shift from the embodied church to something almost in between. We are almost like in the liminal. We are in the liminal of something, some sort that we have to think. So then we have to engage the people in terms of what does it mean to be an ecumenical people, community, for that matter, in that regard. What are we discerning for the way forward in terms of issues of justice, in terms of the church of emergence? What kind of a church of emergence is coming out of this? And I think Roderick has given one way of this, and the radio and all those kind of things. And how does the church that has much more resources, as you have said now, begin to engage these churches on the margins as well in this process of transformation and all these elements that we are struggling with? And I think this coming from Angelique as well, talking about how do we deal with issues of justice and equity and all those things in this multifaceted church that we are dealing with. So thank you so much for taking us to this level to begin to think in terms of ethicalness, the ethical dimensions of a church and how it works. What about the children? What I saw, one of the challenges, especially here in Korea, was to engage with the children sometimes was a little bit problematic for some churches. The children would come and some would be struggling to deal with them. How do we develop the church of the children in that regard as well? So there are all these many elements that we still need to put together and discern the church of the future. How does it look like? Is it going to remain this multifaceted church, or we are going to find ourselves getting back to one stream of church and what it were? So thank you so much for stimulating our thinking on this.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the terms that has become quite popular the last 6 months or so is the term hybrid church, where church no longer can just be offline and it can't be purely online. It has to be, again, this multifaceted, space that kind of connects these multiple contexts. And that means, again, doing a lot of things, not just how we think, but how we do things very differently, and seeing how can we kind of do that, across the ages. In the West, we talk a lot about the death of Sunday school, because, people have many commitments on a Sunday morning, and Sunday school often gets to be the one thing that, the football or soccer game is more important than Sunday school, unfortunately. And so how do we, basically do religious education when we can't physically get the kids in the building? So that hybrid element to maybe kind of thinking of Sunday school as a collaborative activity with parents and kids that's done throughout the week rather than just one day on a Sunday. But thank you for the important issues that you raised.
Yeah,
okay. Yes, thank you, Professor Campbell, for a really inspiring presentation. You mentioned about the kind of possible role of artificial intelligence in terms of our liturgical life in the church. I wonder if AI, not if, AI can organize a best service with the wonderful choices of images, songs, and prayers with excellent sermons. And if AI conduct a Sunday service in YouTube, my question is, of course, it can be a kind of facilitation of spiritual formation, but AI could develop this kind of spiritual formation by itself based on big data. So if we face the AI take away my job, and if we have AI priest in a virtual spaces, what could be our role of humanity in this virtual spirituality? I wonder. Yeah.
Well, I mean, because there already are, robot priests in, Japan, and I've heard about them in Japan. I've heard about them in, there's been robot priests in Europe, especially experimenting with kind of Buddhist priests that, in places where they can't afford a priest, or there's a shortage in some places of the world of kind of different clergy. So could these, robots kind of provide those, kind of leading a service, doing prayers, doing blessings, etc. Obviously there's practically, yes, could they? Of course, but really, what is worship? And what is faith? So I think that while technology can kind of be a stopgap, and there's practical things, obviously, I'm still in favor of kind of their religion has an embodied aspect, and it is about a human relationship with the divine. We don't have space to get into the whole, will robots have sentience, and will sentience equal spiritual transcendence? I don't know at this point. But I think, there's technical things that technology can do, but should they do them? And is that actually the best for, the human relationship with God? But I think there's some interesting debates or issues we could raise about, what people need in a digital age. And sometimes I think it's, is that basic connection. A technology can, and even humans, we can know the practical answer, but do we actually experience the reality, and does that actually change us? Just because a robot can kind of lead us through the ritual doesn't mean it actually is transformed in its inner being. So I think that there's some theological issues that lie behind it.
I'm afraid of that if AI can mobilize all the data of our religious experience and replace divinity. I mean, if AI can calculate all our religious experience with data, then maybe AI could become a god.
There's lots of philosophical questions behind that, I think. Yeah, but what is the essence of being human? And I guess that depends on the extent to which that is the extent to which we say what is human uniqueness in philosophical and theological terms. And can it truly, even if it does the data, it sees it in the data, is that actually truly essence in its spirit or its being?
Okay. Dinabandhu, you have a comment? Dinabandhu. No?
Thank you,
Oh,
Professor Heidi, for that very inspiring and insightful presentation. I just have a comment. It's not a question. Yesterday I was engaged in a conversation with a group of church activists from South Asia, in Sri Lanka and India. We were trying to sort of understand or discern together what does diaconia and mission mean in the present context of the pandemic, and especially for those churches which are on the margins, not just working with the marginalized, but which are on the margins, the people who form the church are those who are marginalized. So in the process of the conversation, we tripped over the question, somebody raised the question, why are we talking about we and they? Where did we get this language of we and they? What the church should do something for those on the margins. Then we kind of analyzed and we kind of discerned that, the language that we inherit, particularly in terms of diaconia and mission, are those that we have inherited. That is, mission and diaconia as something that you do from the position of power and privilege, as if, the church has answers, the church has resources, the church has the capacity, we need to do something in order that we are able to fulfill the mandate of witness and service to the world that we are placed in. So my question here is that, now we are faced with this reality of the virtual church, which depends heavily on technology, not just, the access to technology. And I'm just wondering, whether this is once again adding to that sense of alienation of the church, from the margins, or from being with the margins, on being a marginalized church. In the WCC, we talked about mission not to the margins, but from the margins, mission of the marginalized. So this is a kind of a question that I'm dealing with, wrestling with, because see, like we have been talking about church as an event, church as a space, and church as a happening. But I know, the thing is that, for the people on the margins and for the church at large itself, church needs to be a space for an encounter it's a space for the an encounter and celebration of their common affirmation of faith. So somehow this sort of limits that space of encounter, that possibility of encounter, where, irrespective of your social locations, we are able to be together and celebrate a oneness in the body of Christ. So these are some of the ecclesiological questions that I am wrestling with. I just want to put it on the table to, because your book, you said, I'm going to grab a copy of that, the digital ecclesiology. And I think we need to continue this conversation just as much as we are trying to cope with the reality of the virtual church in this pandemic. But at the same time, it throws up a number of questions, to what does it actually, what will it will do to the church? Because on one hand, people are getting used to the comfort of the church and the experience of the church in the comfort of their homes for those who have the access. But there are those who don't have that possibility. But on the other hand, as my friend Roderick has said, the church is now localized. So in a way, it is also sort of threatening the institutional edifice of the church, the establishment, the power structure, where church is more localized, all of that, the micro reality of the church. So these are some of the questions that I just want to put it on the table, but it's just a comment. Thank you so much for your very inspiring and insightful presentation. Thank you.
I think that you kind of hit at the essence of kind of one of the key debates of the past decade. Is the internet and digital technology, is it empowering traditional, hierarchies, or is it empowering the margins or alternative voices? And the answer is yes. It's actually doing both. And there's many examples where the people who have power online are the people who power offline in many respects, just because they have access to the resources. But can digital technology actually empower the margins of voices? Yes, but it's being deliberate and is providing resources to them. And I think that, we can so much enrich the church and enrich, community ministry by empowering. And that sometimes means, like taking away, the access of the higher elite to give it to, the parishioners of the people, or some people being willing to step down and give up their place at the table, as it were, so that others can speak. And I think that that's important. And digital technology can show us that, kind of equaling out, or that true kind of priesthood of all believers that I think is so needed in many aspects of the church around the world.
Okay. So Dilip, do you have questions?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Heidi, for this wonderful presentation. I have two concerns. One concern as a pastor who is taking care of the church, and another concern as a guy coming from a Dalit and from a marginal background. My first concern is that we have been having this online service for the last 9 months. We never had a service offline in the church. So for the last 9 months, we have seen ups and downs in our viewership of our streaming of the worship. We have been doing this worship on both YouTube and Facebook, and also on Zoom. One concern that have been troubling or challenging for me and also for some of my friends is how to engage the church in this digital era. Like most of the time we speak to the screens or we speak to the displays, and most of the times the congregation listens to the displays and screens. We do not know whether the congregation is following the church. We do not know whether they are being in touch with the church. So that challenge has been troubling us a lot. What happens when the pandemic is over? What happens during the post-COVID era? Whether church will be back to the building, to the community or not is one concern. My another concern as a person coming from a Dalit background, this pandemic has raised a unique challenge to some of the Dalit pastors in India, especially in margins. This has given an opportunity to the mega church pastors to sheep steal the congregations in villages. When I say sheep steal the congregations, like these pastors from margins, they go to the villages, they toil, they work hard, they get in touch with the people, they reach the people in the villages, and with all their hard work for the past 10 years or 20 years, they have established small churches, like churches of 20 to 50 people as their congregations. All of a sudden this pandemic came and gave them challenges of getting in touch with their churches. So what is happening in some of the local congregations is that these mega church pastors reach these small villages, set up their screens, and they are preaching from their own church. Then all these people suddenly started going and participating in the mega church congregations online, because these pastors in villages, one, they are not accustomed to the digital technology. Number two, even if they have been accustomed to the digital technology, there are challenges of bandwidth. There are like numerous challenges that I can name. So in this unique challenge, especially in villages where these congregations are going to the mega churches, leaving their pastors, leaving their congregations, has impacted the pastors in margins a lot, because they have all their toil, all their hard work for the past 20 to 30 years is going to be in vain after this pandemic is end, because they have no guarantee that the church will come back to the building. So how do we deal with these kinds of issues? These are my two challenges.
Well, I think one of the things the pandemic is done is kind of, as it's kind of had to move outside the building, it's kind of challenged people like, what really is the church? Is the church a Sunday gathering? And is it important to get everybody back in that building on a Sunday? Or, maybe it's about the relationships, it's about fellowship, it's about community building. And, whereas, it's hard, you can't compete against, flashy lights and music and, the high tech, but it's, if people are really looking for a relationship during this time, I think, and that while they may not be able to get, maybe it's about the pastor rethinking about, well, how do I do church? How do we be church? Because when people invest in relationships, it doesn't matter how flashy your service is. They may tune into your service, but they're not going to invest their time or energy or in kind of building that. I mean, I think a lot of people are maybe not tuning into the smaller services, but at the end of the day, are they going to really? They're not going to be physically going to that big church. I think it's about pastors saying, okay, how do we actually be the church rather than just create the church event? And that's hard because I think a lot, again, I'm speaking from Western culture, the whole model of religion in the West has been, let's create, it's all the programming, all the money, all the efforts about what happens on a Sunday morning. And I think a lot of churches are saying, hey, we actually need to flip that model because it's not become helpful and it's not sustainable in times of crisis. And it actually doesn't build what we thought we were building. We thought we were building community because we all got in the same building on a Sunday, but we actually don't have community. We just have people coming to a program. And I'm not saying it's happening in that context, but it's maybe forcing pastors to think about how can we remodel the church, or, where do we actually put our energy and resources? And maybe it's in something different than what they have been.
Okay, it's almost time to wrap up. Maybe I think this is the last question from Michael Blair. How in a digital world, based communities can we think about connecting with the communities outside of our buildings? This is a question from Michael Blair. Dr. Campbell?
Well, I think it's, first thing is, getting outside the building and kind of looking at, is that I'm not sure if that's about like building connections with other churches, or if it's building, with people who are not part of the church community and being the church in those spaces. But I think, one of the things that I've seen is, churches, well, we can't physically meet, but how could we actually, turn, our small groups into kind of, mini churches, whether they're in the home or whether in the community, churches that, said, okay, let's start a delivery service for people who can't get out and can't get their medicine or can't get their food because of health issues. They can't move out of the house. And so I think, there's been a lot of interesting, opportunities where students are saying, people are rethinking how do we be church to our community, and maybe in small ways. I know, like my husband and I, we started this before the pandemic, but we put up what's called a blessing box outside our home. It's like a micro food pantry, so it's an old mailbox. It's been reconditioned, and we put food in there. And over the course of the last 9 months, a real community has kind of formed around that space, that people come to pick up food or toiletries that they need. They leave us notes, and we also have a space where they can leave prayer requests. And so we've been able to pray for people and talk to them via the phone. We actually now have more people come by the prayer box to get these encouragement cards that have Bible verses or little prayers on them than food now. And that was just something, my husband and I did just in a small way to kind of reach out to our community during this time. And I think that, the church can really use, I think it's people have a lot more creativity than we give them for. And it's about empowering the people, say, hey, how could you reach out to your small community or your neighborhood where you're at, rather than just kind of, building the programs of, the church or the church building. And I think if every, small group in a church or every family did one small thing for their community, they'd have a much huger impact and presence known in their in the world than maybe even just investing in a huge evangelism outreach campaign or whatnot by the church once a year.
Thank you. I think this is a kind of international webinar. So all the participants from all over the world, mainly from Asia, Korea, India, and Indonesia, and also the Jamaica, the Middle America, and also even Hungary. Yeah. So, but the majority of our participants belong to Global South. So if you see the questions, so the terminology, so from the perspective from the global south, is people who cannot access to the internet, or accessibility, digital divide, or the perspective from the margin, something. So we have many tasks to develop our theological reflection in digital age from global south perspective, from global south, also perspective of global laws. So that is our future task things. So thank you very much, Dr. Campbell, for your time and your effort to, although you are very busy, but you make a good presentation. So we give a big hand to her. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Campbell. So our KIFE director, Dr. Goom, you have any announcement?
Once again, on behalf of the three organizing bodies, World Alliance of World Communion of Reformed Church and Korea Institute for Future Ecumenism, Transformative Ecumenism Collective, I would like to say a big thank you to Professor Heidi Campbell for your excellent presentation. Tomorrow, Professor Jennifer Reith from the ILIF School of Theology will talk on nurturing transformative ecumenism at the level of people and communities. So please join us tomorrow, same time, 10 o'clock in the evening in the Korean Standard Time. Thank you.
Okay, our long journey to our series of webinar almost close to, so see you tomorrow. So let's close in prayer, in the Lord's Prayer in our mother tongue. Let's pray. 하늘에 계신 우리 아버지여, 이름이 거룩히 여김을 받으시오며 나라 임하옵시며 뜻이 하늘에서 이룬 것 같이 땅에서 이루어지이다. 오늘 우리에게 일용할 양식을 주옵시고 우리가 우리에게 죄 지은 자를 사하여 준 것 같이 우리 죄를 사하여 주옵시고 우리를 시험에 들게 마옵시고 다만 악에서 구하옵소서. 나라와 근세와 영광이 영원히 아버지에 있습니다. 아멘. Okay, thank you and bye. See you tomorrow. Thank you, Dr. Campbell.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.